You are live.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are. My name is Aaron Danis. I'm a faculty member at the National Intelligence University here in Washington, D.C. Welcome to the seminar, The Double Ontology of Gaming as a Method. Today's speaker is Dr. David Banks. Dr. Banks is an international relations scholar who focuses on diplomatic history and practice and wargaming and conflict simulation. In the autumn of 2020, he joined the King's College War Studies Department as a wargaming lecturer and the academic director of the very excellent King's Wargaming Network, one of my favorite things to watch whenever it's on the web. His wargaming research has investigated the potential use of cyber weapons in future conflicts and counterinsurgency techniques against Boko Haram, which is something I need to follow up with you after this, David, at some point, maybe after the conference is over. He also has designed a number of conflict simulations for use in the classroom. His current wargaming research is focused on determining epistemological standards for evaluating war games and simulations as research method. In addition to his wargaming research, Dr. Banks also studies diplomatic practice in international society, with a special emphasis on symbolic and rhetorical diplomacy. He's been published in International Studies Quarterly in a variety of media outlets. And he and I share an alma mater. He received his PhD from George Washington University in 2015, where I got my master's degree in 1991, David. So congratulations to you. So I'll turn it over to you at this point.
Thank you very much, Aaron, and welcome everyone, and thank you for joining. The subject of today's presentation, as the title suggests, is making two moves before the first move, the double ontology of gaming as a method. And this quote here from Ludwig Wittgenstein here kind of captures what I'm trying to get at a little bit. The first step is the one that altogether escapes notice. We talk of processes and states and leave their nature undecided. Now, what this is really about, when I'm thinking about this, is that when we're trying to think about developing wargaming as a scientific method, very often the application of wargaming jumps past a number of steps. Here I'm calling them the two moves before the first move being the design of the game itself. I'm making a claim that there's two ontological moves that have to be made before a game can be put on more solid scientific foundations. And I really want to make it clear that that's what this presentation is about. It's about trying to understand ways that we can evaluate wargaming and gaming in general as a scientific method. So as many of you, I'm sure, know, wargaming is frequently treated as an art in the wargaming community. And also it's recognized that it's something that's subject to a lot of external pressures in their designs. Any particular war game is going to have a sponsor. It's going to have all sorts of resource limitations. It's going to have requirements from various bosses, Dan Martin's famous Three Witches. And so we recognize that it's subject to its own pressures that come from the professional world in which it's developed. However, there have been increasing calls for application of scientific standards to wargaming. And so this presentation, which is based on a paper that I'm currently working on, is a first attempt to try to understand what that means, what it means when we try to put wargaming on a scientific foundation. So what does it mean to make analytic war games more scientific? Well, I want to start here with a definition that's really an amalgam of a number of different definitions I've come across, but one that I feel like captures the unique features of wargaming and what it means when we say analytic wargaming. And so here I'm defining analytic war games as representations of conflicts or competitions in which individuals pursue objectives, make decisions, and experience and respond to the consequences of these decisions with the purpose of generating new knowledge. That is to say, the game's purpose is the generation of new knowledge. So what I'm going to do in the remainder of this presentation, you can see there's a lot going on here on these slides, and hopefully we'll get through them together. But what I'm going to do here is, excuse me, I'm just going to set my timer slightly. I'm going to first give a sense of what I mean when I'm talking about science, so that we can at least get the baseline standard understood, and then go into a little bit more about what the role of ontology plays in science, before turning over to what this means when we start to apply these standards to a particular rigid Kriegspiels. And I'll explain why I focus on rigid Kriegspiels a little bit further on. And then, if time permits, I'm going to show you my attempt to have done this by analyzing a existing war game, one that's very well known, a RAND war game, Reinforcing Deterrence on NATO's Eastern Flank, which came out about 5 years ago. So let's here first talk about what I mean by science. Now, of course, for many people, science conjures up ideas here of quantification, of numbers, of these kinds of ideas. But that's not necessarily what science means. And in fact, that's one particular version of science, what we usually call some form of positivism or logical positivism or neopositivism. But that's actually just one expression of science. So what I went looking for was a broader definition of science, which will capture a little bit more what science really means, because it should be noted here, and this is taken from Jackson's book, The Logic of Inquiry in International Relations, which has been used by Ellie Bartels in her own research, is that science, for philosophers of science, there's very little agreement about what it is, beyond perhaps saying something as general as an empirical inquiry designed to produce knowledge. Science is not something that philosophers of science have settled on, what its contours are. And so that's very important for us to recognize that before we start trying to analyze games. We have to recognize that science itself is a contested concept. Now, that said, I think it's probably fair to say, and I'd be happy to be criticized here, that scientific arguments typically have two dimensions. They have ontological dimensions and they have epistemological dimensions. Now, ontology refers here to the things that we think are, and I will develop out this idea a little bit further as we go along. And epistemology here refers to what we can know and how we can know it. And so these are the kind of two core sort of foundational blocks that go into any scientific understanding of something. First, we think that particular things are, and then we think that particular things can be known about those things, and then we come up with ways that we try to figure out those things that we can know about them. Now, in saying this, I say here that science has ontological, has an ontology. Well, drawing here on Jackson, I make the point that scientific arguments have two ontological commitments that precede all subsequent analysis. And so let's go into what I mean here by this. The typical way that most people understand ontology, now, as I said, ontology is the things that are. I remember when I first tried to figure out what ontology meant when I was in graduate school, I went to a dictionary and it said a theory of being, which is a deeply unhelpful definition that doesn't really give you any insight. But the way that it's typically understood for most researchers is that it's the catalog of objects that are subject to study, right? The things that we see when we go looking at the world, right? What we think are the things that we're going to collect, the conceptual containers that we're going to gather evidence into is our ontology. And this is the way that ontology is most typically used by, I would contend, the vast majority of researchers who are even familiar with the term and use it frequently, right? They're really referring to this catalog of objects, right? These are the things that are. However, there's actually another ontology that precedes this, which is the philosophical ontology that we ourselves as researchers hold at any particular time about what we think exists in the world and how we are hooked up to the world itself such that we can try to understand those things that exist. Now, I'm not going to get dragged into this for too long. So for those of you who are finding yourself reeling slightly, I'm going to try to make this slightly clearer, but I'm happy to return to this at any point in the Q&A. But as I hope will make clear, the point I'm trying to make doesn't completely live or die in this sort of stuff. But it is important to recognize these things. And I want to go through them one at a time and understand what the stakes are of these things, because people are going to look at this perhaps and say, this seems like a lot of abstruse philosophizing. Why should I care about these kind of concepts? And I want to make the argument about that both of these things are crucial for us to be able to understand and evaluate any particular war game as a scientific tool. So let's talk about, and so these here, of course, are the two moves that I'm referring to, is that any researcher, whether they're doing it explicitly or implicitly, it doesn't matter whether you know you're doing it or whether you don't know you're doing it, you're doing it. You have a philosophical ontology and you have a scientific ontology that's going to go into the way that you design research. And so really what I'm kind of pushing for here is a much more explicit recognition of our philosophical ontologies and our scientific ontologies. And my claim here, as I hopefully will demonstrate, is that by doing this, we'll have a much better grasp of ways to be able to evaluate the work that we're seeing. So let's look here at this first move, this philosophical ontology. This is a less familiar term here. as I suggest, but it's perhaps the most important, is because this is the one that determines our relationship with the world. As I said before, ontology refers here to the things that we think are. And so this philosophical ontology is the things that we think as individual human beings think that exists in the world, things that we can even in principle understand about the world. And so knowing this, if we sort of think, so one of the kind of ontological commitments that we might have is we might have a belief that there is an objective world that is separate from us as individual human beings and that is fully knowable, separate from us. I'll come back to this when I talk about Neopositivism. But this is an ontological commitment we have, because fundamentally this is something we'll never actually be able to determine one way or another. It's just something that we're going to be committed to. We're going to say, I think it's out there, I think it's objective. And if you do think that, that's going to affect your choice of methods. It's going to affect the kinds of tools that you'll use to try to understand this world that you think is objective and separate from you. It's also going to determine what you think those methods are telling you. It's also going to affect the way you interpret the results of those methods. And so this is very, very important, because this really, it doesn't just determine, will I choose a war game to study something? It would also tell me, what is a war game going to tell me as when I study this thing? You may design a game that might be identical, but depending on your philosophical ontology, it will tell you different things, or can tell you different things to different degrees of sort of success. Now, there are four major approaches that Jackson identifies in this philosophical ontology, and I'm very happy to talk about these in the Q&A if people are really curious. They are what he calls Neopositivism, analyticism, critical realism, and reflexivity. Now, I'm not going to get bogged down in how he comes up with this typology or any of that kind of stuff, except to say I'm going to just talk about these two for the purpose of the remainder of this seminar discussion. I'm going to talk here about neopositivism and analyticism. These are going to be the ones that they're going to focus on, and I'll explain why when I get to them in a few moments. So let me talk here briefly about the second move, the one that people are more familiar with, in so much they're familiar with ontology at all. And this, as I said, is the more common understanding. It's the scientific ontology that any researcher has. That is to say, this is usually what we refer to as the catalog of objects that kind of quote unquote exist in a theory we have. So we have a theory of the world. We think that public opinion affects electoral outcomes. And so that means we think we're going to be able to find an object called public opinion. And we think we're going to be able to find an object called an election. And we think we're going to be able to figure out some sort of way of determining how these things work together. But we're confident, first and foremost, that there's an object called public opinion. We're going to have to come up with ways of measuring it, whatever it is. But we think that there's something out there, a conceptual container that we can grab onto. And so this ontology, the scientific ontology of a theory, informs what is analyzed. So your philosophical ontology tells you what kind of methods you should select, and it's going to tell you how you're going to interpret the results of that selection. But the ontology, the scientific ontology, tells you what it is that you're looking at, what it is when you go look at the rich empirical world in which we live, what it is that you can see, or more importantly, what it is that you should look at, right? What it is that you can dismiss, what is epiphenomenal, what is not going to be crucially important, what's going to be the critical variables that you really want to fixate in on, and so on and so forth. And of course, if you're evaluating a number of theories at the same time, you might sort of have a theory of your own, and you want to make sure you evaluate some other theories on the same evidence. They're going to generate their own ontologies, but you're going to be looking here for these things that match those theories. Let me give you an example of a game that in its own way has an ontology that's very similar to a prominent international relations theory called Neorealism, which I'm sure at least some of you are familiar with. If you've taken an international relations course at any time, this will be a familiar idea. This is a very, very dominant stream or theory that exists in international relations thought, which posits that the world politics is fundamentally anarchic. That is to say, there's no world government. Any world government that you see, like the UN or the WTO or NATO or anything, these are sort of shells. Yes, they're clearly there, right? We can empirically see them, but ontologically speaking, they're not doing very much, right? They have as much real world fundamental impact in politics as hair color does. or whether or not politicians have large mustaches, right? It's not really seen as a crucial variable that we have to worry about, right? So the system is anarchic. In this anarchic system, material power is the only power that matters. Yes, there's other kinds of power. Of course, you know, religious leaders or charismatic leaders have a certain amount of power, but fundamentally all power rests on a material base, and that states are all fundamentally the same. Yes, there's democracies, yes, there's autocracies, but basically they all work the same way in the system. For those who've played the board game Diplomacy, it is Neorealism, the game. It's a game in which all the countries are functionally similar. The only thing that's different about them is their geopolitical situation, their geographical situation, but they're all subject to the same rules. Politics doesn't matter. Domestic politics doesn't matter. The only way to survive is to expand your power materially, and there's no other world policeman you can turn to. You're on your own. This is the ontology of Neorealism, and it's expressed here for those who are interested in kind of getting a feel for it in this board game Diplomacy, which I should note, incidentally, precedes the theory of Neorealism by about 25 years. So it's a strange coincidence. At this point, I'm happy to take any questions that might have appeared. I should make it clear that I can't see the Q&A, but Aaron has very kindly offered to read out anything that might have popped up.
I don't see any questions in the queue as of right now. So if you want, unless somebody, I can give a few seconds. Nope, looks like no questions at this point. I would just continue. Okay, great. So hopefully that was reasonably clear, right? Just as a quick refresher, philosophical ontology here is going to determine the methods that you select, including wargaming, but not, of course, the only thing being wargaming, right? And then also help you determine how you evaluate the results, what these methods are producing. Your scientific ontology is essentially informing your theory, right? It's the way you develop your theory. And as I've said before, and I think this is typical of most people who study this sort of stuff, you have these, whether you think you have them or not. So, you know, there's an occasional retort to this type of philosophizing, which is what a lot of philosophy ideal in the real world. Well, here the response would be, no, you just haven't thought through your ontological commitments. So it's not that you don't have any, it's just that you don't have any explicit ones. And so without the explicit thinking, critical thinking about what your ontological positions are, you are likely to create some sort of potential problems in your theorizing. But it doesn't mean they go away. They're thinking about you, even if you're not thinking about them, to put it another way. Now let's see what this means in terms of applying this to wargaming, because I remind you the key point here of this initial foray into these kinds of questions is figuring out ways we can apply scientific standards to war games. In particular here, I'm looking at rigid Kriegspiels. Now, the reason I'm going to look at rigid Kriegspiels for this particular argument is because rigid Kriegspiels here, firstly, I've got to put limits on what I'm writing about. But secondly, rigid Kriegspiels here are good reflections in some ways of the logic of both neopositivist thinking and analyticist thinking. That is to say, with both the neopositivist and analyticist traditions of science, one of the shared commitments that they have is that your theory of the world should be arrived at deductively. That is to say, you should logically derive your theory. You should sort of say, well, I think that that smoking. Obviously, there's going to be some empirical basis for this, but I mean, you're going to say something like, I think smoking is going to have some sort of effect on cells, which are carcinogenic. I think it would logically operate like this. And I think I'm going to have to conduct these kinds of tests to figure that out. And then you conduct the tests. And so in this sense, your theory is, at least in principle, fully formed intellectually and logically. And then you start to conduct your tests. That's sort of similar to rigid Kriegspiels, right? Where you've written the rules, it's all locked in place, and now you're going to run them and start determining the results. This, of course, is not true for things like Matrix and seminar war games, and I'm happy to offer my initial thoughts. I've thought about it, but I haven't written about it in any kind of detail about what I think this sort of stuff means for those. But here in this case, I think that this kind of the logic of neopositivism and analyticism works well when we think about rigid Kriegspiels, because they share that kind of first step of, I'm going to work this all the way through out of my head, at least in principle, and then I'm going to apply it to the evidence in the same way that a war game designer might say, I'm going to build this entire rule set, and then we're going to play the game and look at the results, right? It doesn't have this
at least in principle, it doesn't have this iterative response, at least at the initial stage. So let's talk here about Neopositivism first, then I'll talk about analyticism. And in each case, I'll explain a little bit about what these kinds of logics expect in general from science, and then how that shakes out in terms of games, and what that would mean for what games are doing for a neopositivist, and what games are doing for an analyticist in the types of knowledge that they can generate. So what are the neopositive commitments here? What is it that they think about the world? And these are kind of philosophical, ontological commitments, right? What are they thinking about the world and thinking about their relationship to the world and the relationship to their ability to produce knowledge about this world? What do they think? Well, neopositivists, most of us are essentially soft neopositivists. This is what most of us think of when we think of science. We think that science is neopositivist. And for those of you who are interested in reading Jackson's book, he goes into great detail about a lot of people are actually doing different types of work. They're actually operating in one of these other kinds of traditions he identifies, still actually think they're neopositivists, right? So this is very much the kind of dominant discourse of science. And so it's kind of very hard for us to unthink it. But what its basic idea is, there's a world that exists out there. There's a world out there separate from us, the observer, that exists separately, and that is subject to a bunch of laws that we can at least sort of establish and find out how they operate. We're looking here for the laws that regulate the universe, of which we are just one other object in it. And so we come up with theories about how we think something works, right? We come up with theories of physics, about how we think motion operates. We think that, I'm not a physicist, so you'll excuse how bad this analogy is going to be, but we think that, you know, when something accelerates and gets to a certain velocity, something else will happen. And then we go ahead and test this theory, right? We test this theory against the reality, and we try to see if there's a correspondence, right? I have a theory of how gravity works. Now let me drop this horseshoe off the Leaning Tower of Pisa and see if this is going to be corresponded to by what we see in this objective outside world. The purpose of this kind of scientific endeavor is to identify those generalizable systemic outcomes, right? We're trying to figure out what happens out there. We recognize that in any particular case, there might be variations, but we're trying to get the overall general type of activity that we see out there. Yes, if you drop a feather off the Leaning Tower of Pisa, it's not going to fall as quickly as a horseshoe. Maybe it's going to go the opposite direction, but we're trying to find what the kind of mean response will be, right? What the average outcome is going to be across all these cases, so we can understand the law of gravity, right? So that we can get this baseline law, and then we can build knowledge off the back of that, right? These are the neopositive commitments. We think there's a world out there. We think we can get to sort of figure out ways to observe it and get to understand it. And we do this by engaging in empirical experimentation. What this means in terms of the epistemological anxieties this generates for neopositivists is we want to make sure that whatever sort of smaller experiment or smaller study we're doing in our laboratory, or when we're doing, for example, polling 1,000 people to try to understand what the entire population of a country thinks about something, is we want to avoid error in that correspondence. We want to make sure that, you know, we're pretty close to what the actual systemic outcome is out there in here, right? In our little limited experiment that we're conducting here, we want to be as confident as we can be that this little experiment is externally valid, right? That this is what's going on out there in the rest of the universe. This is the logic of an opinion poll, right? This is when you look at an opinion poll and it says plus or minus 3 points. We're sure that the average person, that 62% of people are going to vote for this candidate, and we're confident up to this sort of range of probabilities, right? We think we've identified, roughly speaking, what the mean behavior is. And so the concern then, as I say in this approach, is about avoiding these errors in correspondence, right? We want to make sure that we're not getting these badly wrong. That's where this goes wrong, right? Because if we say we conduct an experiment, a drug test, and it seems like the drug works really well at combating something in this controlled experiment where we had 1,000 people take the drug and another 1,000 people not take the drug, but it turns out we're wrong. We turn out actually in a much wider population, the drug will have a far less effective result, or it'll actually do something harmful, right? It's that idea of is what we're doing here locally going to be a fair representation of what happens out there systematically. And so, of course, this is, especially in social science, right? For those of you of social science, have to kind of go through this kind of material. This is typical, right? This is regression lines. This is outputs. This is where we try to find probabilities of something. We try to identify the mean of something, and it's how much it deviates, how variant it is, and how confident we are that this is what we would see again if we conducted the experiment with new data, and so on and so forth, right? It's all about trying to find out, is this data we have now representative of this larger world? And if so, then we can start being confident that we figured out, the law of gravity, or the law of voting, or the iron law of party selection of presidential leaders, or whatever it's going to be. Any questions about neopositivism in general before I talk about how this applies to games?
Any specific questions? We have a few comments.
Okay.
Not any specific questions as of yet. We can come back to these later if need be.
Yeah.
Anything for questions? So I would just carry on.
Okay. I'd like to imagine this will all cohere more as we get further along. So hopefully it'll become clearer. Let's think about what neopositivism means here when we use games as a method, right? So you've got your neopositive commitment. You're going to use games here to study something. Well, what are you going to study? Well, neopositivists are empiricists. So they study real world phenomena, right? They want to look at the actual data of real world things. How will you vote at this election? What happened when people took this drug? So they look at real things, and from these real things, they make claims about the wider world. And so for positivists, the thing you study when you study games, and this is very common, and of course most of you are very, very familiar with this, is you analyze the player decisions. And from a positivist approach, this makes perfect sense, because this is the only thing here that might represent something bigger than the event, right? If you look at the game for the positivists would say, well, a game just represents itself, right? It doesn't represent something else. It's just a game. But the decision, people have made decisions in a game. Maybe if that game is a faithful representation, is making them subject to pressures that they would feel in the real world, well, then maybe this game will help them have those experiences. They'll behave in particular ways, and we'll have the confidence that this is how a real person in a real cyber war or in a real nuclear escalation would operate, right? So it's about, they look at these decisions that they make in the game, and then they are going to make claims that this is what they think would happen in the real world. The purpose then of games from this position is to run many of them, as many as you can, right? To generate as much data as possible, which reduces the variance you get in the outcomes you see, because it gives you a greater sense of the efficiency of the estimates you're getting about behavior. And then maybe you might change the game design or the game state in some particular ways to see is this going to generate some sort of different systematic behavior. So you're going to make it so that players are primed to think about nuclear weapons, or you're going to make it so that the opposing team has got more vulnerabilities on game version 2 to see if that changes escalatory behavior or whatever it is. And so, of course, this is very familiar, I'm sure, to most people who are listening to this, but this is this basic logic. And so then the key concern for these kinds of games then, of course, is to make sure that they're externally valid, right? That these results that you've created here in your gaming laboratory are externally valid. They map onto what would happen in the real world. And so the pressure here in using these in these models is to make sure that that's working properly, that external validity is not being created, that you don't have some sort of bias or some sort of error that actually means that you're not getting correspondence, that what looks like is happening here is not what would happen out there. Now let's look here at an analyticist logic, because at least I suspect for some people, the feeling might be, well, isn't that what all games do? But actually, very many games are doing something quite different. They're doing something that aligns much more with what's known as an analyticist logic. Now, what are analyticist commitments? Well, like neopositivists, they want to start with a deductive theory. They want to come up with a theory about the world that they see. However, unlike neopositivists, they're not confident that they can truly understand the world separate from the theories that we use to interpret it. The out there is never really going to be identified. It doesn't mean that they think it's all relative and that there's nothing we can say, but they recognize that our own lenses determine what we see. It determines the questions we ask. It determines the way we interpret the evidence. And what might look like a law-like generalization is just the way we understand something operating. It may not be the way it actually operates at all. And of course, the classic example of this is that Newtonian physics can get us to the moon and back, but Einsteinian physics aren't an adjustment of or a development of Newtonian physics. If Einstein's right, Newton is wrong. And they're actually contradictory, right? They don't agree with one another. And here for analyticists, this is not a problem. They're like, well, if you look at it through Newtonian physics, you can get to the moon. But if you look at it through Einsteinian physics, you'll understand the relationship here between time and space. And it doesn't mean that one of them's right and the other one's wrong. It means that they do different things. We understand the world differently when we view it through these lenses. It reflects back something to us that we see differently. What it actually is doing, we can never know because we can only see it through our own ability to experience it. Now, do they still believe here in empirics, right? Like neopositivists, they're also empiricists, but they recognize that whatever this evidence is telling us, it's not telling us something law-like about the universe. We're not discovering the laws. We're just being able to interpret things. The purpose then of science is to generate, at least I would contend, this is my interpretation of analyticist position. The purpose of science then is to generate knowledge of this world in a way that helps us to make sense of things, right? It's to help us to be able to understand it, not to discover it, to figure out what's actually happening. That's not the purpose. The purpose is to be able to understand what's happening in a way that makes sense to us. And then the epistemological concern, what we're worried about then when we're engaging in theorizing and testing, well, not testing, evaluation and analysis, is that we're concerned about producing knowledge that's useful to us, that's going to give us insights, that will make us understand things in ways that we wouldn't have understood if we hadn't engaged in this scientific endeavor, that will help us to think about problems in ways that we hadn't thought of before, and to also direct our attention to interesting things, interesting quirks that perhaps we wouldn't have expected. We work out our logical theory and then we kind of evaluate it in the real world and we find it actually doesn't quite work the way we thought. And that's interesting in itself. It's something I'll return to now in a minute or two. Let me give you an example of research that Jackson contends, and I agree, is fundamentally analyticist, even though many of its users say they're engaging in neopositivist research. And this is game theory. Because game theory here begins with a kind of assumption about reality that it knows isn't true. All human beings are rational. We know it isn't true, right? We just know that when you ask human beings to behave like rational value maximizers, they won't do it. But that doesn't matter from an analyticist position. We say, let's set up a universe and let's imagine a world in which they are these rational individuals and they have these kinds of abilities to calculate very, very efficiently, and they're maximizers. They always want to get the best value for their choices. Here, an analyticist would say, well, let's say if that was true, what's sort of the kinds of things we can understand about the world if we kind of make that sort of logical theory, if we kind of sort of deduce that theory, and you can come up with some very, very interesting observations, right? The classic one here is the prisoner's dilemma, that it makes perfect logical sense that actors engage in activity which is mutually harmful, even when there's a better alternative right in front of them, where they could get something more by cooperating. It makes perfect logical sense that they don't do that. So that's the deductive model. The deductive model here is this, but then how this would work as further analyticist research is that, of course, when individuals take this out to the real world and conduct real experiments, they find out that people don't behave like this. And that itself is very useful, because now we say, okay, we had this deductive model. If people were perfectly rational, they should do this. But now when we actually do have real people doing this game, they behave in a different way. And that's interesting, because now that either means our model is wrong and we can kind of tinker with the model, or it might direct our research in new and interesting ways. So what does this mean for analyticism in games? What would analyticists want if they were in gaming something? They're not trying to figure out what would actually happen in the real world, because that's not the point of these projects at all. It's to try to understand dynamics, perhaps and typically only for the particular case they're looking at. Well, here, games are representations of systems through which we might view the world. So here, analyticists would say, I know this game is a simplification. I know I'm leaving things on the cutting room floor. I know I'm making assumptions that are heroic. But let's accept that, and let's kind of think about, well, how would the world operate if these things were true? And kind of what would that tell us then about the things we might learn? And critically, as I said, when you take these models and you bring them to the real world, the empirical world, I shouldn't use the word real, it's not quite the right word, but when you engage in empirical research of some kind with these models, we'll see deviations, right? Things will happen that the model wouldn't have predicted. And these deviations can be very interesting because they can create points of further refinement of the theory. Okay, that's weird. People shouldn't have behaved this way if this was true, but they did. So what does that tell us? Maybe people are different than we think, or maybe the cyber weapons actually will generate different kinds of pressures that we hadn't thought about. We need to go back and reflect on this. Or it might direct us into completely new areas of study altogether. Oh, look at this. All these kind of interesting sorts of coalition dynamics or alliance dynamics appeared that we weren't prepared for at all. And yet the game, even though we didn't see it inside this logical model, it was nonetheless possible. And so this can direct us into whole new areas of study. The key concern then is we want to create game environments that are likely to generate some of these unexpected deviations, right? We don't want to kind of design a game that we know that everyone's going to behave in a particular way. We don't want to design a game that's going to automatically generate weird results. But what we would like best is some sort of game where, as we study it, we might learn interesting things that we hadn't considered beforehand, right? It will kind of reveal to us some dynamics of this model, right? This logical system we've created in our minds that weren't apparent to us even when we created the model. Now, what does all of this mean in applying theories to games? And I think I'm still good on time here, so I'm going to just take a moment here to walk this through.
Yeah, you're good on time, David.
Okay.
You got about 25 minutes left total time, so if you go another 10, that still leaves 15 for questions.
Yeah, I think I should be able to get in by that time for sure. So let's think about what all of this means, right? Because again, people might be thinking, who cares about this sort of stuff? Well, my retort would say scientists care, or at least scientists should care, because we've got to figure out ways to be able to evaluate games. I need to know when I've looked at a putatively scientific war game, well, how do I know this one was a good one? Oh, what's my basis here of establishing, well, that was a better quality one than that one, right? We need to know what this is. And the temptation is to say, well, everyone really enjoyed it. Or maybe it accidentally corresponds with reality. We'd say, oh, look, it actually worked. That's what happened next in the real world. But is that a coincidence? Is that a fluke that you just got lucky? Did it happen in the real world for the reasons that it happened in the game? How can you know, right? We've got to start figuring out ways to come up with this language. And so here, the way this shakes out is, at least my argument is the following. Here, first, we have to ask ourselves, is our theory explicit, right? Before we choose gaming, have we got an explicit theory about the thing it is that we're studying? Have we made it very clear what our scientific ontology is? How do we think this universe of which the game is a representation, have we been explicit about this? Yes or no, right? The game of diplomacy here could have, in principle, been very explicit that this is neorealism, the game. It wasn't, but it might have been, right? But you can sort of say out loud, I'm very explicitly, we're going to run a game, but before we start, I want to make it very clear. I think that international institutions couldn't intervene here under any circumstances. And that's why they're not in the game design, because I think international institutions don't have any real effect. And here's why. Or I think that allies will automatically buckle if they're threatened. That's my assumption, and here's why that's my assumption, and that's why this is in the game. So is it explicit? Yes or no? Have you established that scientific ontology clearly? Have you made it very clear? And then, does the game, the model you've designed, the game model you've designed to test this theory or evaluate this theory, is it connected to this theory? Is it really reflecting those scientific ontologies you have? Is that coming back out into the way the game itself is operating? Now let's look at the perfect example first. Let's say yes. Okay, let's say you've done it. You've really articulated very clearly what your theory of this particular event or phenomenon is, and then you've very clearly articulated why you think this model, this game you've modeled, maps that really well. Well, what would that mean for a positivist? It would mean that you've got an externally valid model. It means that you've set it up so you think, I'm very confident that people would be subject to these kinds of pressures under these kinds of circumstances based on these kinds of research findings in other areas, and I've modeled the game to make them be subject to those pressures and not other pressures or ancillary things. I've really tried to create a kind of a matching here, which means that when they decide to push the button in this nuclear game, I'm fairly confident that that's actually what would happen, because I've really tried to make this experience not just synthetically good, does the model connect to the theory, I've tried to be very clearly that about the logic, the foundations of that theory itself. For an analyticist, you would have set up your game so that you've been extremely explicit about how you think the way this particular political phenomenon works. And then you've tried to, articulate that political phenomenon. And now if something starts happening in this game that kind of deviates from the expectation of this model, of this logical theory you have, well, this deviance is really interesting because you've really tried very hard to map the game to the theory. And so if something odd is happening now, you can be confident that the oddness is not because of there's some sort of design flaw, there's some sort of disconnect between the game and the theory, or there's some sort of shoddiness in the theory. It's happening organically, endogenously inside the game. Something's happening in the game that you hadn't expected or the theory hadn't expected. And now you can start directing your attention towards that and say, well, that's really curious. That's really interesting. Now, I'm happy to return to the negative downsides of these if people want me to. I don't want to get bogged down in going through every single dimension of this, but I will just point out here that the critical point I want to identify here is that when things go right, it means, if you've done this correctly, at least according to the way I've set this up, it means different things depending on the type of knowledge you think you're producing, right? It's not the same thing, right? An externally valid model is not the same thing as one that creates useful deviance. And when it starts going wrong, if your theory is disconnecting in some way from your model, if you haven't really been explicit about your theory, well, that's going to create different kinds of problems for these different kinds of scientific approaches. But either way, they're going to start creating, we should be able to identify those problems. We should be able to say, aha, I think this is where the game fell down. It's because you hadn't done this, you hadn't clearly connected your model. The game model itself wasn't really clearly connected to your theory. And as a consequence, it created, say in the analyticist example, no insights into system dynamics. And I'm happy to explain how I reached all of these different summaries. Okay, so it's a lot, but tragically, unfortunately, the reality is, I would contend, that when we start to engage in really trying to put something on solid scientific foundations, it is a lot. And we have to accept that it's going to be kind of brain burning. Also, I would not even dare to contend this is the final word. And I can imagine that there's all sorts of very fair lines of critique into what I'm saying here. But it's an attempt here to begin to do this. Now, let me try to apply it, right? What's the point of all of this if we can't actually apply it to something? And here I'm applying it to the game that I'm sure many of you are aware of that was run a number of years ago in RAND, reinforcing deterrence on NATO's eastern flank, Wargaming, the defense of the Baltics. This was a game in which, well, I can give the quick summary here, right? So let's get a quick summary of the game and its findings, and then let me give you how I think how to interpret this game, kind of interpret the scientific strength of this game, or how can we evaluate this through a social scientific lens. So this game was an operational war game representing the Russian invasion of Estonia and Latvia. It was conducted a number of times, with the idea being, the kind of motivating logic of the game was that the Russian players' goal was a strategic goal to demonstrate NATO's inability to protect its most vulnerable members and divide the alliance, right? So in this kind of hypothetical universe, Russia wants to break up NATO, and it wants to do it. And so it does this by invading the Baltic to show the most vulnerable members that they're vulnerable, and the alliance will start to fragment. The game was run many, many times, showing that the capitals of both Estonia and Latvia fell at best within 60 hours based on the current NATO deployments, and that it left the NATO player with very, very poor strategic responses, right? That essentially this would be a situation where Russia sets up a fait accompli, it takes the territory, and then it begins to negotiate, right? Not unfamiliar. And NATO's left with these poor strategic responses of either launching a counteroffensive, escalating to the nuclear level, or conceding, all of which are deeply unpleasant. Now, this game, I really commend this game. I think it's a very, very good example of, I'm going to explain why I think it's an analyticist game in a second. And it had very much strong real world impact, right? This had a real world impact, right? This really informed NATO's posture in the Baltics. And so it's a very good example of a real game having real results. But how do we know it was good, right? How can we evaluate this game? How can we know this was a good game from a scientific position? Well, let's here try to identify its ontologies, right? What is it saying? Well, first and foremost, this is an analyticist game. That's my contention. Because the object of study is not actually something empirical in the event, which is then used to make claims about that exact same event taking place systematically, right? So it's not what will players decide to do per se, because then would players make exact same decisions at another time. It's much more about how would this system operate, right? How would this system operate? How would this thing called NATO operate? How would this thing called the Russian military operate? It's not really only or even mostly about particular decisions per se. That's not what you're sucking out of the analysis. You're sucking the system out of the analysis, right? What you're getting out of this is the whole thing working together with all the various causal factors interoperating, right? Maneuver warfare, aerial support, artillery, and yes, human decision making, right? So all of these things are modeled in, and then from this you kind of step aside and say, what does this game tell us about what would happen in an invasion, right? It's like a sort of a single case study. It's replicated many times, but here the value doesn't come from the fact that, oh, we've replicated more and more, we'd know that's what would happen, because all it would tell you is more and more replications would just give you more and more, from a positivist position, more and more replications of that game. But what it would tell us from an analyticist position is, how do we think these things are working together? So I contend here it's an analyticist game. Now, where does it fall down? Where would I say, okay, we can begin to recognize a limitation here? Well, here I would say that the theory is implicit. There's an implicit theory here. It's not clearly stated and articulated. And so we kind of have to, it's kind of just put forward as something that kind of makes sense, and then the game starts to run. And you remember, what is the theory? Well, the theory is Russia here is going to invade the Baltics with the mind towards establishing that NATO is weak and drive a wedge in alliance partners, right? That's what this game is analyzing, right? That's the proposition. That Russia would do this. It would do this for a particular purpose, to break apart NATO, or to weaken NATO in some way, and these wars could do that. Well, there's a lot of implicit theorizing here. There's a lot of stuff about the way we think that conflict between nuclear-capable alliances operate. Here, the authors have subscribed implicitly to the stability and stability paradox, right? That between two nuclear-capable states, that because of the fear of mutually assured destruction, that creates the stability at the strategic level, which makes instability possible at the operational level. You can fight wars operationally precisely because people know they won't go nuclear. Now, I might also note later on, when they talk about potential NATO responses, the nuclear threat reemerges as a potential danger of escalation or counter-mobilization, but it's not present in the initial game. So there's an assumption here that it wouldn't matter. There's an assumption here of limited crisis escalation. A recent study in the nuclear literature has come up with a typology of understanding different ways that nuclear crises would escalate. And here, this is landing on a particular model implicitly of how nuclear crises might escalate between nuclear capable states, I should say. Material power is crucial, right? There's no UN here, right? There's no political repercussions. There's no economic responses. There's no Chinese backlash. None of this stuff is modeled in the game. This is not inherently a criticism of the game per se, but it is not there in the theory, right? We don't know what the authors say on this. It's just, and so we have to kind of implicitly figure out, okay, well, then a material power is the key determinant of outcomes. And then crucially, this last idea that if these alliance members fall, it would cause the other alliance members to start to fragment. This is an expression of one of the claims of Stephen Walt about the fact that weaker actors, when presented by a major threat, will bandwagon to the threat. That is to say, they will move away from the existing alliance they're in and closer towards the major threat in order to try to avoid that threat harming them further. So this idea that if you invaded neighbors, it would cause other neighbors to drift away from the alliance, that's an assumption here that would line up with balance of threat. That would be very contrary to some other theories of what happens in alliance dynamics. And so there's a lot of implicit theorizing in this. Now, where it's very strong is the model does connect with the theory that we can sort of implicitly glean together. It maps well, right? It's a strong operational war game. It uses accepted gaming techniques, and it's also consistent, at least with my reading, limited reading, on how military operational warfare works at the academic level, right? So it's the model itself is very, very strong, but the theory itself is somewhat implicit. And so what does this mean? Well, I don't have the slide up now, but the slide earlier talked about what happens when you've got a situation where you've got an analytic game which has an implicit theory, but a clear connection, is you're really uncertain about the outcome's relationship to the theory. We don't really know if this outcome is somehow a response to this theory. And in fact, that's kind of what we see, right? we walk away from this game and we're like, well, we're not really sure if this really would pry NATO apart, right? I mean, this game doesn't really tell us that. And it kind of, in some ways, kind of can't tell us that. And so we're kind of left here with the criticism that the model is excellent and the theory is not terrible, but it's just not clear enough about what it was expecting going in. And so we're not really able to evaluate that core claim of this is the kind of thing that would cause NATO to start to fragment. So just a quick final point about where do we go from here? Well, there's a number of, this is a very, very first initial cut at trying to figure out ways to evaluate wargaming scientifically. But one of the things here that to do this is that if we want to make wargaming, for those of us who do, get on a more solid scientific foundation, we have to adopt scientific standards. And the scientific standards here are we have to be systematic. That is to say, we need to be extremely clear about our connection between theories and methods and outcomes and all those kinds of things. We have to be public, which means games have to be published. And we have to be able to provide the worldly knowledge, which of course I think is already occurring. We also have to be sensitive to and develop the unique features of gaming as a method. Because one of the things here that gaming really offers here as a social scientific method with real promise is it has a number of really unique features that are unique to it. Competition between human players, immersion. There are things here that don't exist in survey experiments or large-end statistical techniques. There's something truly unique here, and we need to try to figure out what these unique dimensions of gaming are doing that other kinds of methods are not. But we also have to recognize that there may be a fundamental tension here between professional and academic standards and expectations. It may not be possible in every case or any particular case that a professional war game can also be a scientific war game. Because if a professional war game is subject to Martin's Three Witches, it may not also be able to systematically be subject to scientific standards. For example, publicity being one of the major ones, right? Being public and open to open critique. It may not be able to do both those things. And so that might leave any individual game being forced to choose, to continue the Shakespearean metaphors, to be or not to be. Which one does it want to be? However, I do think as a final point that even though any individual game has to make that choice, I think overall these two things running on parallel tracks will just be very useful and reinforce one to the other. Okay, I thank you for your attention. I recognize that was a long presentation, but there's obviously a lot going on here, and I'm very happy to take any questions at this point.
All right, David, I recommend pull your slides down. We're going to post, we didn't have a lot of questions, we had a lot of commentary.
Okay,
so
great.
Strong's over in 8 minutes. You go to the breakout room for this, the chat room, and you can read some of the comments. And perhaps you could meet with some of the commenters in one of the voice rooms after. There's a number of those kind of breakout voice rooms that are available for people to go chat on topics. And you may want to do it there. But I did ask them to take at least one of these and kind of split it into two banners here real quick concerning that last part about the Rand war game that we're, a lot of us have read about it. It was published a couple of years back. And this was the first kind of comment question that we're aware of this, but because a lot of us haven't had a chance to play it, we're commenting on basically a narrative that somebody else wrote. It would be hard for us to validate it without getting firsthand experience in playing it. Any comment you have on that?
So I think I know, I mean, again, I'm showing my own personal ideas about this, obviously, but I think here this would be a little bit like sort of saying, the equivalent here would be saying, I'm not sure that, your statistical regression generated the results you said it generated because you haven't shared your data with me, right? When I hear a statement like this, that's similar to sort of saying, I don't know if this game generated the results it generated because I haven't had an opportunity to kind of run the data myself, right? But I think what I'm trying to get at is it's a prior question, which is, the way it was set up, at least in the published version, and I say this with the greatest respect, I think it's very good research, but it's not clear what the theory of kind of the world and politics is that's expected to be happening kind of around this game. And I think it's perfectly fine that you want to have a game in which you're saying, well, this is a game that's modeling a very unique circumstance. Let's imagine a world in which nuclear escalation will not occur in the event of a Russian invasion. Let's imagine a situation in which crises can stabilize between nuclear capable powers. Let's imagine a situation in which once wars start, non-military factors don't affect outcomes, right? So it makes no difference if you go to the UN and get a resolution. It makes no lick of difference if sanctions regime comes in with Chinese support. None of that will stop anything. And let's also fundamentally make the assumption that this will break an alliance, right? Because that's kind of the logic of the scenario. All of those things are defensible, right? Those are completely defensible positions. But what you've done then is you've really narrowed the scope conditions of that game to be a game that represents that kind of possibility, right? That type of version of politics, which is a very narrow kind of subset. And that would be that. And so even whether you play the game or not, it doesn't affect the fact that, at least my contention is that seems to be what the game is implicitly modeling to begin with, a universe subject to these kinds of restrictions and constraints before we even get to the quote unquote evidence, right? So I'm not sure if I'm being clear about what I'm getting at here, because I think some people here could look at this game and say, it's actually whether I get to play it or not, I don't agree with any of the results to begin with, because I don't think the evidence supports the claim that aggressive action causes alliances to fracture. So it would actually kind of make no difference. And furthermore, I don't think that states launch invasions to fragment alliances. So then in that sense, if that's your position, right, which is a theoretical position, then the game can never tell you anything, no matter how well it's designed, right? Validation here is not really the critical factor because the premises are not something that you can accept. But my contention here is that in standard social science, and this is an argument being made as a social scientist, you have to have those premises explicitly lined up so that individuals can evaluate whether or not they kind of agree with the way that you've chosen to model your theory before they even get into whether or not they agree with your model.
Okay, we do have one question, and we have just barely enough time for this. We're down to about 4 minutes. They should be posting up now. What are your recommendations for persuading government and military leaders to take seriously the need for scientific validity of the games that they use to inform serious decisions? In other words, that they have that to underpin it.
I think that's a really good question. I think here, the best thing to do here, I mean, this sounds like such a self-serving statement, but it's essentially to allow funding for gaming that isn't about a particular scenario that they want the answer to. It's just about, let's try to get a better sense of what these foundations are. And I contend that would reverberate back very helpfully to the professional wargaming side. I sometimes think here the relationship that might be developing, because I realize that the scientific foundations here are very much in their infancy. I sometimes, when I talk to some of my colleagues about this, see this is a little bit similar to the relationship between engineers and early scientists in the Industrial Revolution, where engineers were being tasked with real world problems that had to have real world solutions. I want you to build me a railway between Stockton and Darlington with the cheapest possible money as efficiently as possible. And they produced those railways. But when you asked George Stephenson, what is the fundamental logic of the chemistry of internal combustion? He said, I don't know, and I don't care. That's not my job. I can make it work. But at some point in the second industrial revolution, you started to get the growth of universities that would just study these questions for their own sake, right? Universities don't study, or at least in principle, don't study a lot of the most important scientific breakthroughs. The germ from which they emerged was something that didn't clearly have any immediate application. Hey, let's see if we can make a laser work. Let's see, hey, what is the fundamental nature of an atom? It's not clear when that question was first being asked it was going to lead to an atom bomb. It did lead to the atom bomb, but that's not what motivated the question. The motivated question was, what's an atom? And so I think that if there was more funding into that kind of research around gaming, just what is going on, that would rebound backwards to being able to get a clear sense of what those, kind of what's going on in a good or a bad game. So I don't see them in opposition to one another. I see them in a very complementary world where developments in the professional world affect the academic and back and forth. But I do think in any individual game, it's probably difficult to do both. Because if you're being asked to build a train to get from Stockton to Darlington, you can't also be asked at the same time to understand, what's the fundamental logic of combustion, right? You can only do one thing at a time. But it's obviously useful to know both.
Okay. I was told by our producer we can go a little over. We do have one more question. This will be the last one. Mm-hmm. There was a request in the chat room when you go in there after for some other publications you may have or other areas where you've published on this previously. So you can certainly add that in the chat room on Discord. and there'll be plenty of fodder for discussion in there, I can guarantee you, when you get there. So last question, if you take game insights as abductive conjectures to be explored by repeated games and other methods, such as analysis and exercises, does that help your ontological approach?
Yes. So I think this is, you'll notice I bracketed, right? I bracketed rigid Kriegspiels because I think that, left out of this discussion is the way a lot of games actually operate, which is Matrix and Seminar. And I think what they probably have is they have a much closer relationship to a particular philosophical ontology, which is known as critical realism, which is this idea that there's observable things out there that we can't really see, but that we sort of know are there. And the way those are discovered for critical realists is kind of through an abductive method, right? Where you go between theory and evidence, and you kind of try to capture them, right, through some sort of lens. And so I do think that that's fundamentally probably the logic of a critical realist approach, right? When you have people sitting down in a Matrix game or a Seminar game, they're trying to work it out, how these things come together. And here, from a critical realist position, is they might be getting a sense of the actual thing out there, right? The kind of capturing the model. That's subject to different evaluative standards, which I haven't gone into that level of the development yet. But I do think there's a huge space for that. But that's not the same as the rigid Kriegspiel stuff. So I limited myself to that form of theorizing, which is deductive rather than abductive, which to me is similar to writing a rule set.
All right, thank you. We are at a minute over. So with that, we will wrap. I thank you for your presentation. It definitely generated a lot of discussion. Recommend that folks meet David in the chat room afterwards, and maybe you guys can take it so where you can actually talk to one of the breakout rooms that the conference organizers have provided. Of course, you may want to get some dinner first, David, before you jump into that. It may be good to have something to eat first. Thank you very much, and appreciate your hard work on your presentation today.
Thank you so much, Aaron, and thank you, everyone. I'm just glad people attended. Okay, thank you.
All right.
Bye.